right, in this Cwic Media Come Follow Me episode, we're going to be covering chapters 7 through 10 in the book of Mosiah. And this is kind of interesting the way this starts off here. We need to understand times, dates, to really understand the flow of things here. Remember that we've just gone through the time of King Benjamin with his people, the covenants that they made there in King Benjamin's speech. But we're setting up a time now here where we're going to go back in time, about more or less 70, 80 years here, to the time of Zeniff. And so let's see how we get here. Now remember that King Benjamin gave the kingship to Mosiah, and then 3 years later he passed away. So that's where we are here in about 121 BC, as now King Mosiah is going to take over. And he starts off here in chapter 7 here, Moroni does, kind of interestingly. He says that he wanted to know concerning the people who went up to dwell in the land of Limhi Nephi, or in the city of Limhi Nephi, because they hadn't heard anything from them. Well, again, this is about 70 or 80 years after these people have left Zarahemla to go to the land of Nephi, or Limhi Nephi. And so, but again, all of a sudden it just is kind of dropped in our laps here, similar to the way chapter 1 started off in Mosiah, as if the book of Mosiah had already been talking about this, and it hasn't. So again, that's probably part of what was lost at the beginning of the book of Mosiah with the lost 300 pages or so. But Mormon, through his abridgment, is setting us up here where we're about to go back in time. So chapters 7 and 8 are kind of a bridge for us until we get to chapter 9, which is going to set us square about 70, 80 years before the time of the new King Mosiah here. Now we do get a little bit of this out of the book of the Words of Mormon, right? Which was written much later, obviously, at the time of Mormon. But it is inserted before the book of Mosiah, right before the book of Mosiah. And this is what Mormon says about that time that's kind of interesting. He says, "And it came to pass also that the armies of the Lamanites came down out of the land of Nephi," this is during the time of King Benjamin, "to battle against his people," against King Benjamin's people. So here's at this time, during the time of King Benjamin and his reign, the Lamanites are coming from the land of Nephi, Mormon tells us. So they're occupying the land of Nephi. And so if you haven't heard from those that left 70 or 80 years before, or whatever time period this would have been, 50 years before, during King Benjamin's reign, when he was leading the battles against the Lamanites from the land of Nephi, what would you think of them? That they've been maybe exterminated, right? That they had perished by the sword. So the new King Mosiah now sets up a scouting party led by a man named Ammon. Now this is not the Ammon who is one of the sons of Mosiah. This is a different Ammon, right? Here's what we get in verse 3. "And it came to pass that on the morrow they started to go up, having with them one Ammon, he being a strong and mighty man." Now, why is this not the son of Mosiah? Because we're told right afterward, "And he was a descendant of Zarahemla, and he was also their leader." So when they say a descendant of Zarahemla, they're not talking about the city. They're talking about the man that the city was named after. So Zarahemla was a man, and Ammon is his descendant. So he's a Mulekite. And he leads this scouting party of 16 men to go and try and find the land of Nephi. But they don't know how to make their way to the land of Nephi. Remember, it's been since Mosiah, the grandfather, came out of the land of Nephi. So we're talking about 2 generations since someone has gone back to the land of Nephi. And maybe almost 3 generations. And so we're told here, and Ammon, by the way, is not an uncommon name. And for maybe a couple of reasons. Number one, it could be an Egyptian name, right? Coming from some variation of Amun, the god Amun, right? And then also you have the people of Ammon, or the Ammonites, that are usually a group of people adjacent to Palestine, to Canaan, that are enemies to the Israelites and the Jews. Although sometimes they did fight together against, say, for example, Assyria. So there could have been a time where there were names that were borrowed from them. They fought together. But Ammon here is obviously a common name with a very few people that we have written about in the Book of Mormon. We know of at least two here. But don't confuse this Ammon with the Ammon who chops off all the arms and goes to the Lamanites as a missionary. So they're gone for 40 days, which is maybe literal or maybe not. And they wander and they come to a hill. And this is the same hill that Mosiah would have stopped at. The grandfather Mosiah would have stopped at the way out of the land of Nephi to Zarahemla, right? This is a place that's closer to Nephi, the land of Nephi, that seems to be a very common place that you would naturally go to. And in fact, there's a city that is created there next to this hill that is just north of the land of Shiloh. So Ammon then takes from there, not wanting to go any further into the land of the Lamanites, he takes 3 of his brethren and they go down to the land of Nephi. Now, as they get down there, they are taken by the guards, they're bound, and they're put into prison. And it just so happens that the king there, who is a Nephite, King Limhi, is out and about outside of the gates, outside of the walls of the city. And so the reason that they were taken and bound by the guards is that they didn't know who they were. And interestingly enough, they were afraid that they were Lamanite scouts, or maybe Lamanites that were sent to assassinate King Limhi. So King Limhi gives them that explanation as the 4 men in total here are brought before him. But what's interesting here, again, is, we talked about skin color a little bit here, and I've gone over this a few times as we've gone through the Book of Mormon. This is a very good example of why do they think they're Lamanites, right? Why do they think they're Lamanites? It's not because of their skin color, obviously. So these are people that are the same people of Limhi, right? The same race, the same descendants, but for whatever reason, right, the guards in Limhi and the people there thought that they might be Lamanites. And so Limhi drills them, right, questions them, why are you here? And so Ammon, speaking to King Limhi, says in verse 13, I am Ammon, and am a descendant of Zarahemla, and have come up out of the land of Zarahemla to inquire concerning our brethren, whom Zeniff, that's the record we're going to get to in a moment. Zeniff is the grandfather of King Limhi, whom Zeniff brought up out of that land. And Limhi is ecstatic, right? He didn't know what might have happened to those that were in Zarahemla, if they still existed, and they're hoping for a way out of their situation, right? They have been put into bondage by the Lamanites, taxed of half of all of their increase, and they can't keep this going. They just can't keep doing it. And so they're hoping that they can get the help of their brethren from Zarahemla to get them out of this situation one way or another, even if they have to become slaves to those in Zarahemla, because it would be even better than the position that they're in now. And again, slavery was very common back in the day in all parts of the world. In the Western United States, we think of the very horrific examples, right, in the Western world of the slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade. But that's a very small part of all of slavery over time and throughout the world, right? That was a common thing. It wasn't until really the 18th century that things really started to change a little bit there, and then very dramatically in the 19th century. So King Limhi has all of his people come and be gathered at the temple. Now, what temple is this? Remember, they are in the land of Nephi. Now, unless they had to reconstruct a new temple, this temple would be the temple of Nephi, right? This would be the temple that Nephi built after the design of the Temple of Solomon. It would be the same one. This would be the temple that Nephi and his brother Jacob spoke at, right? Very different from the land of Zarahemla. So we're kind of coming full circle back to that. And he says a couple of important things here as he begins his speech at the temple, which, again, what we're going to start contrasting here is the land of Nephi and the land of Zarahemla and parallelism here. We see this because this is both tradition and ritual, and because Mormon is going to want to put in a contrasting example between King Noah, who is Limhi's father, especially, and King Benjamin, right? They're the exact opposite, and that's what Mormon is setting up here for us. But they are here gathered at a different temple now than King Benjamin was at in the land of Zarahemla. And he says, recognize and put your trust in God, in that God who is the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And then he goes through examples. You remember, it's helping us to remember what God has done. The God that took them out of Egypt and through the wilderness, crossed the Red Sea, provided manna, etc. And then he says he has kept and preserved his people. All right, we've talked about that word preserved especially. And notice here, it is put right in with his people. Who are his people? God's people. They're the people that are covenanted to him, right? They're the people of the covenant. And so, again, preserved is put right where it seemingly is supposed to be, based on our last couple weeks' discussions here. And then he says, it's because of our iniquities, talking about the people of Limhi, especially of Noah, and the abominations that he has brought us into bondage. So, again, we've got a cause and effect here. And this is a very, I think, important lesson to learn, especially in the Book of Mormon, but throughout the Scriptures, that iniquity is not just something that kills our spirit, right? It's not just something where we have a spiritual consequence from this, but there are material consequences. And one way or another, it's something where we end up being put into bondage. Even on a spiritual side, for example, if we make bad decisions, we can be put into spiritual bondage. If we end up with bad habits, that in a sense is a spiritual bondage. Or we are desensitized from the spirit. We are binding ourselves to something more carnal and not allowing the spirit into our hearts. And of course, then a physical manifestation of that would be actually being in bondage, such as are the people of Limhi here. And then he goes into kind of a narrative of how they arrived here through his grandfather Zeniff. I'm not going to go into that now because we can go into this a little bit later in chapter 9. Then he starts to bring up something that's really important here. And to me, this is crucial. And a lot of people ignore this part because he's going to start talking about Abinadi. And really, Abinadi comes several chapters later, the story of Abinadi. But there's some very, very important information here that Limhi is going to give us about Abinadi. Here's what he says, starting in verse 26. And a prophet of the Lord have they slain, yea, a chosen man of God, who told them of their wickedness and abominations. Okay, so this is where, even some LDS scholars start to go in and think that this is why Abinadi was killed, because he was telling King Noah and the priests and others how bad they were, which is certainly true, and certainly that would make them upset, right? But that's not what Mormon is getting at here. Remember, what he's going to be setting up here with Abinadi is the contrast with King Benjamin, where King Benjamin is completely open to the higher law. He is a fully acceptant of the doctrine of Christ, and all of the people, because of the doctrine of Christ that they hear, even though it's a ritual, they accept that. They accept Christ, and they make a covenant to even take on the name of Jesus Christ. That's the central point here, and it's the central point of the story of Abinadi. Just a little bit further here, he says, and this prophet prophesied of many things which are to come, yea, even the coming of Christ. That's the point, right? 27. And because he said unto them that Christ was God, the Father of all things, and said that he should take upon him the image of man, and it should be the image after which man was created in the beginning. What is he going over here? He's going over the doctrine of Christ. And we're included in that, right? This is important to understand, I think, and it's something that we don't discuss enough. I try to bring this up, but what I find, this is just me personally, right? What I find in the doctrine of Christ that is a core principle is about becoming, right? The doctrine of Christ means that we, as is being explained here by Limhi, that we are in some ways the same as Jesus Christ. Can you say that? Yes, you can. It's important to understand that he's a mediator. He's not the Father. That's not part of the plan. That wouldn't work, right? He is made in the image of man, just like we are when he is born to Mary. And what that opens the door to understanding is, number one, that God came down to earth and there's a condescension that is only manifest because of God's love for us, right? That's one thing. The second thing, though, is that, as Limhi points out, we also are in the same image. We were created in the image of God, the Father. And when Jesus is born, he's going to be in the same image as us. Now, what are they saying here? This is all about becoming, right? Without the doctrine of Christ, the full doctrine of Christ, you take out that understanding, the full potential and purpose of mankind. And we see that, generally speaking, in most of Christianity today. The part of becoming is not there. It's gone. It's watered down. But Limhi is very specific about this. And this is one of the reasons that people don't accept the full doctrine of Christ. They will not accept these two things, that God would descend, that he would lower himself that way, right? You can imagine people that are elitist in their thinking, like, okay, why would somebody do that? God is too perfect. He can't lower himself to the very depths of humility. That doesn't make any sense. And then on the other hand, raising man up to that potential of becoming is to them preposterous. And you've heard those arguments. But that is a major part of the plan of salvation. It's a major, major part of the doctrine of Christ. Him descending all the way below us and us ascending up to him, at least to some degree. People just can't absorb that. They can't take that. So man is created in the image of God. Christ comes down in the image of God, or as is said here, in the image of man, right? Like us. In other words, he said that man was created after the image of God. Why is he including this part? Right? He's setting this up right here. In other words, man was created in the image of God. So if God the Son, if there was a Son of God and he was made like us, what does that mean about us? It's a crucial, oftentimes left out part of the doctrine of Christ. And that God should come down among the children of man, right? Emmanuel, that's what that means, and take upon him flesh and blood and go forth upon the face of the earth. Okay. And then in verse 28, and this is very important, and now because he said this, they did put him to death. So when we get to Abinadi next week, remember this. Very important. Why did they put him to death? And I'm going to go through that with you and make that argument to support this exact statement by Limhi. It was not because he was telling them they were bad boys and girls. It is not because of a nationalistic feeling that the people of Noah were the covenant and promised people of God. Not saying that didn't play a little bit of a part in it, but it's not the reason. And you hear that a lot now because of it's a traditional interpretation of the verses that Abinadi is going to go over with the priests of Noah. But I don't buy it. That's me personally. I don't buy it. I don't buy that traditional interpretation. We're being told here why he's killed and what that trial of Abinadi is all about right here. And then he says, if we will return to the Lord with full purpose of heart and put our trust in him, right? That's faith. Put our faith in him, in the atonement and the atoning sacrifice, and serve him with all diligence of mind. If ye do this, he will, according to his own will and pleasure, deliver you out of bondage. Well, there's our formula for all of us if we are in bondage in any way, right? We're stuck in something. Bondage can apply to, I'm on a spiritual plateau and I can't move forward. Bondage is, I can't break through something that's going on in my life. We're told the formula here to break out of that bondage. It's not easy. It's simple. It's very, very simple. And I've been through this several times on different issues. I know it works, but it doesn't make it easy. But first, turn to the Lord with full purpose of heart. Right? You're all in. Jump in with 2 feet. That's the first step. You got to do that. Right? Put your trust in him. So you're going to lean completely on the Lord. Serve him with all diligence of mind. All right? Then you're set. That's your 3-step formula right there to get out of bondage in your life. So then King Limhi has Ammon come up, right, in front of the temple, talking to everybody, and he kind of goes through a history of what has happened since the time that Zeniff left. So again, about 70, 80 years before this. Since the beginning of this people in the land of Nephi. And he goes specifically into King Benjamin's speech from 3 years prior. Right? Again, Mormon wants to put that in there. Why? Why does he make sure that is listed in here when abridging this down quite a bit? Because he's using this to contrast things. This is the bridge that's taking place right now at the Temple of Nephi, the bridge of the comparisons. So then Limhi dismisses everybody, and he has these plates brought to Ammon, right? And he says that there are these 24 plates of gold. These are gold plates, not the golden plates that Joseph Smith ends up with, but these are plates of gold that have been inscribed with a history of a people. And this is pretty interesting because remember that when grandfather Mosiah leaves the land of Nephi, and they end up following probably the Liahona, they go to the same hill that Ammon and his brethren stopped at in Shalom, and they end up finding the Urim and Thummim and the breastplate, which is massive. These are from what they describe as must have been massive people. The Jaredites were huge, real giants. But on that journey between the land of Nephi and the land of Zarahemla, that's where Mosiah finds the Urim and Thummim and the breastplate from the Jaredites. Then he goes over here describing that he had sent a number of men, a scouting party, to look for the land of Zarahemla, to go back and find the land of Zarahemla. They could never find it. But they found a place with countless number of human bones and bones of beasts as well. So great battle that took place here. I don't know if it's the final battle, but great battle that takes place here within the Jaredites in their civil war probably. And they find these 24 plates. And so not going the exact same route, but again, the idea of going between Zarahemla and Nephi, they find these 24 plates. And he asks, can you translate these? And he says, no, but I know who can, right? Someone who is a seer. And we get this comment here. It says that Mosiah had told Ammon that a seer is greater than a prophet, right? Which is an interesting statement. What is a seer? Seems like a seer is someone who can look through these instruments to see things. because not everybody can do that. And in verse 16 he says, and Ammon said that a seer is a revelator and a prophet. And so when we think about the brethren, right, the Quorum of the 12 and the First Presidency, each of them is using these three titles in their calling: a prophet, a seer, and a revelator. And then the last point in this chapter is in verse 20. Just a little tidbit here. It's kind of interesting. This is King Limhi, and he says, "Oh, how marvelous are the works of the Lord, and how long doth he suffer with his people. Yea, and how blind and impenetrable are the understandings of the children of men, for they will not seek wisdom." Right? So if we're not seeking wisdom, then we fall into darkness. Our hearts are hardened. And then he says, after talking about wisdom, he says, neither do they desire that she should rule over them. So Limhi here is saying that she should rule over them. Who is she? Well, she is wisdom. Now, he may just be personifying this, but there are a lot of places in the Bible where that may not be the case, right? It seems to have been stripped down about wisdom, or the lady, right? The lady of the temple. Who's the lady of the temple? Well, certainly we know, even in just the Garden of Eden story, that we have the story of Eve in there. That is a temple liturgy, and she is the mother of all living. And who is the mother of Christ? It's Mary, right? There is a figure, maybe given personification, or this idea, or built off of the idea of something real, like Eve, or a mother in heaven. Wisdom is always female, and even in Greek, for example, wisdom is Sophia, right? It's a personified goddess, which is kind of interesting. When we get to the Old Testament in a couple of years, we'll go over that a lot more. Okay, then we jump over to chapter 9, and this is where Zeniff's record starts. So again, we're in chapters 7 and 8 so far, right? We've been going in the same time period as King Benjamin and Mosiah, right? As King Benjamin passes away, his son Mosiah sends off Ammon and his brethren to go find the people here of Limhi, and he does. But now that we've been given this introduction, now what Mormon does is he inserts the record of Zeniff. And this is from chapters 9 through 22. But if we see here in the chapter summary of chapter 9, it says, when is this? About 200 to 187 BC. So this starts roughly 80 years before what we just went over here. So we're going back in time about 80 years. So Zeniff opens up here talking about how there was a party that left Zarahemla, again, about 80 years earlier, and wanted to go back to the land of their fathers, the land of Nephi, or the land of Lehi Nephi. Maybe they were wondering what had happened to their brethren who had remained, which was probably the majority of the Nephites that were there. Maybe they knew that they had perished by the sword. Who knows? But they wanted to go back to the land of Nephi, the temple of Nephi, etc. So they send a party out there. They get around to the land of Shilom. Again, the hill of Shilom. This is a very common place to stop. Zeniff goes out as a scout to the Lamanites and is among the Lamanites, and he sees goodness there. So the party originally had thought, well, we're going to go out and we're going to slay the Lamanites, which is kind of hard to understand. This might just be in the land of Nephi. There can be kings in different areas, like we have with King Lamoni and his father. But he sees that there's goodness there, so he does not want to slay the Lamanites. And so there's infighting because others do. And so a lot of them kill each other. And they go back to Zarahemla. And then Zeniff leads another, what must have been, it looks to me, based on their battles in the future, what must have been perhaps thousands of people that end up going with him. And they come in and they speak with King Limhi, and they are given the permission to go in and occupy again the land of Nephi and the land of Shiloh. But Zeniff is kind of he's a good character, but he's also not a great character. Right? He says of himself here and of his people that we were slow to remember the Lord our God. And it was very difficult, right? This is not an easy thing to get through these two lands between Zarahemla and the land of Nephi. Ammon, when he had come down, lots of fatigue, famine, thirst. Same thing happens here with Zeniff's people, right? It's very difficult to get through these lands, apparently, and very difficult to find. So it's difficult terrain. And so they go in and they have 12, 13 years here of relative peace, building up this civilization again, farming, industry, trade, etc. And then the land of Shiloh is attacked by the Lamanites, and they go off and they fight them, and they beat them. In one example here at the bottom of chapter 9, he says that we did slay 3,043, and they lost 279 of their brethren. Even if they're a minority, right, if they've got a smaller amount of people that they're fighting with, if the Lamanites lost 3,043, how many were there total in that army? And then they had driven the rest out of the land, so there were probably thousands, maybe 10,000, maybe more, that were fighting. There had to have been thousands of Zeniff's men that were fighting here. And they're not counting the women and children in this, right? What they do in these times is they take the women and children and they hide them, obviously, because that way another band of the Lamanites can't come in and take them prisoners, take them as slaves. So they hide the women and children out in the forest, probably miles away. So what Zeniff goes over here is that King wanted to tax the people of Zeniff. He wanted to live basically off of his people with a heavy laden tax. And they end up doing that later on with Limhi. But in the meantime, they fight off the Lamanites and they hold their own. And they become very industrious, right? Much more than the Lamanites. That seems to be one of the big disparities between the two groups. And they farm, they have large crops, apparently. They make a lot of clothing. They prepare for war with a lot of weapons. And they prosper, right? They prosper very well as long as they're obeying the commandments. And then another time, the Lamanites come in here, their heads are shaved, they're naked other than a girded leather girdle about their loins. And Zeniff says something interesting here, or maybe it's Mormon. He says, "Now the Lamanites knew nothing concerning the Lord, nor the strength of the Lord. Therefore they depended upon their own strength, yet they were a strong people as to the strength of men." So again, another disparity here. The Nephites fight with the strength of the Lord, and the Lamanites don't. And that seems to be a big difference. That makes up for a lot of shortcomings as far as population goes anyway. And then Zeniff continues and he says, "They were a wild and ferocious and bloodthirsty people, believing in the tradition of their fathers, which is this." So this, he lays down why the Lamanites hate the Nephites so much, right? There's a lot of good with the Lamanites. They love their spouses, they love their children, their families. But one thing that is built up here is a hatred toward the Nephites. He says, they believed in the tradition of their fathers, which is this, believing that they were driven out of the land of Jerusalem because of the iniquities of their fathers, and that they were wronged in the wilderness by their brethren. And they were wronged while crossing the sea. So that would be the incident with Nephi being bound to the mast, probably. And again, they were wronged while in the land of their first inheritance after they had crossed the sea, right? That's where Nephi took everything, the relics, the brass plates, and left. And so it's kind of interesting, isn't it? That there is a hatred that is built up partially because of envy, at least. It's partially because of envy. Now, we can give the Lamanites credit where credit is due. And in many cases now, there seems to be a lot of this kind of, well, let's wrap our arms around the Lamanites and talk about everything that must have been good with them. To some degree, that's fine. They're children of God, and there is their tradition of their fathers and this culture that is built up. That is not all their fault. That's not all their fault. And it's the sons of Mosiah later on and others that want to go to the Lamanites to try and reverse this trend, this culture that they have of hatred toward the Nephites and bring them more of the truth. And we get this statement here in verse 14, which we heard about Laman and Lemuel in the very first few chapters of 1 Nephi. He says, and his brethren were wroth with him because they understood not the dealings of the Lord. Right? And so that is speaking of Nephi and Laman and Lemuel. They were also wroth with him upon the waters because they hardened their hearts against the Lord. And again, what does that mean? To me, that's not just saying we're choosing evil. We're choosing what's wrong. It's denying Christ and the doctrine of Christ. And in 17, we get more about this culture, and thus they have taught their children, this is the Lamanites, that they should hate them, the Nephites, and that they should murder them, and that they should rob and plunder them, and do all they could to destroy them. Therefore, they have an eternal hatred towards the children of Nephi. And again, that's such a, we've talked about this before, but that's such a culture of victimhood. You know, when you allow yourself to be victims, individually or as a people, you're putting yourself in a very, very difficult position, regardless of if there have been oppressions or things that have wronged you. If you allow that and allow victimhood to enter in, then you are limiting your potential. It is very difficult to have faith, hope, and charity when you are a victim. And you can see that throughout different societies today, and where there are even wars where some people have not taken on victimhood even after they have lost those wars and have become extremely productive and industrious versus others that maybe haven't. And I'm certainly not valuing one people over another, but I am valuing a culture at times, or at least aspects of a culture where there is attitudes and principles that are allowed to flourish and are promoted even, of hatred and envy and victimhood. It never, ever works. And I think that's an important aspect of the entire Book of Mormon to understand, right? You can see how people like even Enos, right, when he prayed, was forgiven of his sins, struggled with the Lord, and then when he was forgiven of his sins, he had a great desire for love toward his brethren, the Nephites, and then beyond that, going to the Lamanites, right, because he senses that charity toward them, and that even though he is hated by them, he wants to reach out and love them. And so you can see this dynamic with all these different principles that play between two different peoples. One that is inward, where they are in a cycle of pride and prosperity, right? Moving around those things. And one that is based on a sense of victimhood and oppression. And there's many different things that are, right? It's in other words, those that feel oppressed, right? Those that may have had some wrongs done to them even, and feel oppressed, just like we're told in King Benjamin's speech, are we not all beggars? Are we not all also in the image of God? And as King Benjamin says, some of you might say to yourselves, well, they deserve this because of what they're given. Well, remember, a lot of this has to do with spiritual gifts. And they are denied that. They're born into a culture that has this promotion of hatred and envy and victimhood. So if you can see beyond that, then your heart opens up more, right? And you can see that they are in the image of God. And then the other way around, right, coming from the other side, it's when can you see a softening of the hearts of the Lamanites and a reaching out of them toward the Nephites? And as we go through the Book of Mormon, keep that in mind. It's not just good versus bad. It's sons and daughters of God on one side and sons of daughters of God on the other. One side often chooses evil because of the culture that they're in. And one side often chooses evil despite the fact that they have the truth. And so yes, we have the protagonist Nephites and the antagonist Lamanites. But, just keep that in mind as you go through it. Think about the dynamics that would be going on between these two groups, especially for those who are more enlightened on both sides. And that's part of covenant, right? That's part of covenant. And so the Nephites and the Lamanites both, which are Josephites, both who have a mixture of Manasseh and Ephraim, are battling with this whole issue of covenant, reaching out from one side to the other. I'll talk to you next time.